Staying attuned, a poetic gaze, backwards and forward, with folks both brilliant and humble.
A mythic poet, he, gracious with time and soul, the care to share more. Our guest today is Chris Vitiello. He is a poet, the man in the fox costume known as the Poetry Fox, the Durham, North Carolina Poet Laureate, a father, and a general rabble rouser. Like all our guests, he is many other things too, and we will dive into that now.
I have the poem we're going to start.
This is Dreams Not Meaningful. Am I remembering?
Yeah, dreams, as you said, comma, not meaningful.
Yeah.
She, usually she, or come to think also he, they think that there must be, reasonably to them, a significance to dreams. I love that. But I tend not to see the practicality and always seen symbolically the things that seem to be, to me, a day's mere strange data reprocessing. I guess their care for the spiritus air renders daring to simplify, to exercise myopically, and thus a third of life as my time wasted just sleeping.
There's a lot of solid sound going on in that. A lot of E sounds. And then there's like a good pair of adverbs in there as well that picked up on that. Good ly words. Yeah. Yeah, it was hard because when there's a density of sound like that, I was like, stop listening to the sound. Listen, parse the words, brain. You know? Yeah. It kind of like ties a lot of little knots. It becomes this filigree almost to listen to.
Yeah, I think so. You would say that like reading that would obviously be a very different experience. It normally is.
Yeah. I mean, I'm interested in the line breaks, and I assume that you're using pretty short lines. Am I?
Yeah. Like maybe 3 words. Generally.
Yeah. When I write on the phone, like, it's almost impossible to write a poem with lengthy lines. You're always fitting it onto the screen, right? Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, I think that, like, that's always been, the interesting part about that poem to me is that, like, the thesis is really straightforward. Like, people believe that there's meaning in dreams. I don't agree with that. Mm-hmm. For the simple reason that I just think I'm sleeping, and that my explanation for dreams are just my mind sort of having, just playing around or actually never really taking a rest.
It does seem like play a lot of the time. I mean, certainly you've had dreams that were literal, where you wake up and you're like, I know exactly why I had that dream. I'm worried about this thing that's happening in 2 days, like, I'm assuming that everybody has those types of dreams. And then you have those other dreams where you're just like, where the hell did that come from? I don't know where that stuff. But I've always assumed, and I think that there's probably, we're talking about the same thing, that it's you're just like processing everything that you've experienced that's all kind of chopped up and thrown together. And it's all still there, but it's getting recombined in a sort of, maybe not a random way, but also probably somewhat random way. Yeah.
And
so I'm also investing the deep meaning. We both have that kind of suspicion of that, where you're like, maybe, it's. I've always found it ridiculous, those interpretation books, where it's like, if you dream about this, then that means this. But I'm interested in those types of statements. Like, that's interesting conceptually. But I'm also like, but different people dreaming about the same thing mean different things, obviously. You know, like,
Yeah.
Or so your interpretation book means nothing. It's just kind of a fun toy to
Yeah. And I think that like this sort of like collage assemblage of meaning of what to me is often what you just described, and then this sort of like symbolic gestalt backwards of being like, well, that meant that because this ended up happening, therefore moving forward when I spot something like this, it'll probably mean that's going to happen. And if it doesn't, we never remember how wrong we were, but when it does, we're like, there's significance. And I don't really want to like the assertion is not so much that you're wrong to assign meaning like to that person, but I just practically, like, I wake up every morning, my wife tells me all about her dreams. And
She remembers dreams
She
every day.
remembers like fucking details that I am just like, what? And right, when you retell them as a dream is so like what it is, it's not a tidily written story. It's shocking and interesting, but like it's surreal, but it's hard for me to follow, right? And she tells it with a dream tells it with the detail as if I'm dreaming it, the way I'm hearing what she's saying. But I don't ever have anything to tell her. And that's one thing that this is not about, which is just like, can you even remember your dreams? Can you interact with them? I mean, when I was a kid, I'd play with the idea, if I thought about this thing, could I bring it in? You know, like before I go to bed, could I bring Cindy Crawford into my dream? Or could I bring, this, I guess in this case, Dan Marino or whomever, right? Whether it's some celebrity or other like person or specific kind of experience. Like I was always playing with the characters on stage, I suppose, but never being super effective. So I don't know.
Then you had that dream where you had sex with Dan Marino, and you're like, I'm not doing this anymore, right?
Yeah.
Well, so I have a question for you. What about the idea of a collective unconscious? Some type of deep layer of knowledge and being that somehow sits beneath all of us humans, regardless of who we are, and the separate lives that we lead. This idea of deep symbology that means the same thing to all of us, and that we respond to pretty much the same way. Like, does that ring true to you, or I have an ambivalence toward it when you read people like Carl Jung is the psychologist that I think immediately with the idea of collective unconscious, and then there are various literary theorists who've used literature, to sort of prove it, to provide proof for it. But how do you feel about that? The idea that we all somehow share some other kind of psychic layer underneath it all.
Yeah. So first thought, before answering, is just the fact that as we described, the sort of unknowing of what we're writing takes us places. And so that could be obviously in your own mind and being like, I want to understand a little more about biomimicry and organisms because that supports this, but the idea of the collective unconscious, is that what we use? Or unconscious collective? That feels like to me like exactly the sort of response I hope to elicit, something like that, which makes you think and ultimately respond with, I haven't thought about that very much, right? But I may. And what I've thought about, and this is a question back to you, is in that sort of that idea, like, is it equally valid to say that maybe what we're doing as we consider our waking time is really sleeping at that point, or they could be either way? Is that consistent?
Like that idea of maybe living is the dream,
or that they're if they're not even one is dream and one's awake, as if there's value difference, but a nominal distinction of just saying they're the same, effectively.
It's just all experience. No, I think the collective unconscious is this is this deeper thing that's like, okay, there's a parallel with animals. It's like a mama bird cannot tell a baby bird like that, falcons are dangerous. It's not like you can have a little lesson that says, okay, honey, see the bird with the hooked beak? That's a predator and it's going to eviscerate you.
Eviscerate.
But somehow, like, baby birds are born with that knowledge somehow. That there are these certain, like the shape of a falcon, they immediately cover. They immediately try to hide from that. And you're like, how the fuck do they know that? Like, how does that knowledge accumulate? Or in humans, like, when I think about, for instance, the history of mathematics, like basic mathematical functions like addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, these took millennia to develop. I mean, like, brilliant people in the past had to come up with these concepts and develop them and grow this knowledge. Now you learn to add and subtract as a little kid. Like, how is it that we do that? We're not all mathematical geniuses, but adding 2 and 2 to get 4. Okay, got it, done. It's this like knowledge can culturally accumulate, but it also seems to somehow like accumulate in social consciousness through generations. Generations contain and hold easily the knowledge that was so innovative just recently. How does that happen? Is that some collective unconscious thing? How does it get coded into us? How does that bird just born know that a falcon is a threat without having had to learn it through experience? That's interesting, and I can't explain that. The idea of a collective unconscious, that there is this body of knowledge that unites us all and that we all tap into just without thought, pre-thought, just through existing, is a way of explaining that. But it sounds a little, a little Stevie Nicks for me to really buy into it, frankly.
Yeah. Well, two questions that came to mind, or at least one. The first one is that in your description of the falcon bird, predator, prey of the baby bird, right? And then you move species to human in a domain like mathematics that took millennia. I guess the part that's confusing, or the part that I'm interested in if there's a distinction there, or if there's not, that maybe means something, which is the bird. I understand exactly what you're saying. In essence, it's very mysterious, the trajectory of like how a baby bird learns that. And you said, it's not like it can learn that from experience, because that experience, well, it's dead.
Yeah.
But, the actual, this sort of, the natural selection side of things, or a pressure, like a way of explaining that, of course, is just like the fitness of the bird who knows how to hide means it, right, can reproduce. And then maybe, right, basic ideas there that
those traits get passed on.
Could be explained just as the memes, just as genes are to memes in knowledge, right? But my point was more, it seems like the explanation you were tying the baby bird to was that other knowing, right? That you said is passed down in a way that we can't measure, maybe. Mm-hmm. But the mathematics side, we can measure. We have a history of that. But I guess my question is, are 5-year-olds better at math than 5-year-olds hundreds of years ago?
It's really hard to say.
Or is it they have a tool, a language to encode those thoughts of the brilliant mathematicians? Or is it both? And one's creating the other.
See, like, you're picking up on natural selection as an explanation for the bird's uncanny ability to hide from falcons. Yeah, like you're applying that to the idea of math. I mean, certainly cultural knowledge is different from like that kind of existential knowledge, I think. Well, although maybe it isn't. Maybe it isn't essentially. Maybe all knowledge is existential knowledge.
Well, that seems like what
down to it. Yeah.
the collective conscious would imply.
Yeah. But, civilization tends to, or societies, let's go with societies. Societies tend to, once they have an innovation, they standardize upon that innovation, and then it's not, you don't have to re-innovate that. You don't have to learn the whole history of mathematics to be able to add 2 and 2 as a kid. It's just a new cultural baseline that you are started at. So it isn't a miracle, but I've always wondered about it. Like, it was such a reading back through the history of math. It, like, there was debate and resistance to it. People didn't trust addition. Subtraction.
Addition can't be
You're
trusted.
trying to pull something over. You're trying to pull the wool over the eyes here. Just the abstraction of numbers was a big deal. Like, 3 for a long time wasn't just 3. It was always 3 of something. It was like 3 cows. There wasn't this idea of 3 like that. That wasn't a thing. So
super
that
interesting
abstract jump was huge. Was huge for us.
I got a couple places, but that I want to go. But the one thought of just, it's stuck in my mind that, honey, school today they're going to talk about addition, but beware.
Yeah,
you can't trust them.
Here's a grain of salt.
Yeah. And I'd really like to meet him. Bring him back to the house before you guys. But
I think as an anti-capitalist, you should actually send your kid.
Yeah,
you're like, you'll find in life 2 + 2 sometimes equals 3.
Well, check it out. That was then, and now we're so comfortable with math that we're dictating things to Siri. Essentially, all kinds of concepts that math is then, or ChatGPT, right, is giving us some truth. Like, we've come to the other side where math is so true that we trust it to write copy for our marketing ad or whatever, right?
Yeah.
For our technical handbook or
relinquishing control of our thought.
But we don't need to go down the AI path. But that was just something there.
I think we should return to the poem.
Yeah,
because there was an interesting thing.
Do you want to sit it or
the start of the poem? I think we could pull it up, but like, there was this kind of, you started off with sort of she, but then maybe also he probably, and there was almost like this kind of, it wasn't hedging, it was this kind of cutting before you got to the point. There was a bit of a chop to the argument to get to the initial statement. A couple assertions, elaborations, shifting of position. It was shifty at the start before you kind of got into it.
Yeah,
I thought that was pretty interesting. Why was the poem like that?
So when I wrote it, there was an individual. We were at Shay's dad's house in Oakwood. And Paradigm does workshops every few weeks, very casual events, and a few hours. And we were outside writing. It was time to write something, and I had finished what I had written as far as the prompt. And I overheard, and they had too. And Shay and Bex were talking about some dream stuff, and I just immediately thought, like, my sort of cutting there, or the shakiness of it, was largely this idea that it's not just she, and it's not an other than me. It's in fact maybe me, or closer to me, which is he. And so there was just something fun there. That was a tacit sort of acknowledgement that everyone seemingly has some, even if they have an ambivalence, as you say, towards the collective conscious, is not against it. I mean, that's why you say ambivalent. So, that was that. And I think it was this question of gendering a sort of tendency, which, if you said, I don't know, I don't want to go back necessarily to more Stevie Nicks, but I don't know. I guess if I asked a question like, who's more likely to own a store that sells crystals? A person that identifies as she or identifies as he? I guess that's kind of what I was checking back on it, being like, this is not a she thing necessarily, although it feels like it is to me often. So,
Yeah, could be. And I mean, in your own household, your wife remembers her dreams with great frequency, and you don't. So there's a sort of gender difference there that you experience on a daily basis as well.
yeah.
So.
And I believe there's more interest in her girlfriends than her guy friends or even her husband, and communing and talking about dreams.
Well, I think that makes sense to me. I mean, I think that women are more, at least in a middle-class American society, but probably much more pervasively than that. Women are more inclined to be intuitive, to follow intuition, whereas men are more inclined and taught. They teach themselves to do this to stay with physical world. It's like,
and as you,
I don't want thoughts and feelings. I want a table and a truck.
right.
Yeah.
And as you say it, like I thought of the phrase spiritus air that I used in there. And to me, it's like the spiritus air is something that mystics and new age hippies and others than me, I consider myself rational. I consider myself someone who would understand the baby bird as a sort of evolutionary pressure genetically on that, right? Which is very much a man, largely because men like Darwin were running and creating those theories because they were men in that time, right?
Yeah. And this goes back to the title, because the title has this sort of taxonomic overtone, like an index entry, dreams, comma,
mostly
meaningful.
Meaningful,
It's like there's a category and a subcategory. The category of dreams, the subcategory of mostly meaningful.
Yeah.
This sort of rational application of, well, let's see if we can categorize everything. That age of enlightenment practice. I love that stuff. I mean, over my lifetime, that version of capital R rationality has come under real interesting critique and a lot of different kinds of critiques. But I sort of cut my teeth on some of those taxonomists, Roget. I read Roget's biography. He's a lunatic, truly a crazy person who needed to let's take all the words and try to sort them into categories and describe the entire relationship of every word to every other word within the language. That's a crazy impulse.
Yeah.
Yeah. All those guys, and they were all guys. They were following up this impulse to try to explain everything through a systemic examination of it.
Yeah.
And the idea is total understanding. Yeah. Yeah. It's not too different from writing into the unknown.
Well,
let's see if we can get all this down on the page.
Yeah. And when you think of the empirical and the scientific method and rationality and all of that, you think of, what do? You posit, you have a hypothesis.
Yeah.
And then ultimately, in a best case scenario, which is not always the case, and often not, somewhat not, you follow a procedure to extract the facts, to test something that you've posited. And you you look through all literature citing this and that, and sort of the domain expertise in the glacier beneath the water coming to your tip of the spear, as maybe look at it, and you reference all of that, and you write down obviously your methods that you're going to try, and then you write down those results that you found, and then you draw conclusions. And ultimately, is this experiment repeatable? Is super important. Okay, basic scientific method. There it is. Well, what's interesting to me is that they're often relegated to testing only certain things that can be measured. Mm-hmm. So I feel like a lot of times what you and I are talking about, maybe in both our work, is essentially that assertion is the hypothesis, and then the rest of the method is a dialogue. But you're also, if someone is in dialogue with you, you're going to then cite this person who influenced you that way. I listened to this on the Huberman podcast. This is Steven Pinker, whatever. This is whatever. And then ultimately, and as you said earlier, like a Socratic method of coming to a greater truth, but never a truth, because the world was once flat and proven not. All these things that science is just proving and getting to greater truth. So I guess what I'm saying is that, like, it seems like they're very related. Just poetry seems to be for things that are less measurable.
Well, I think that it's that rhetorical shape of a poem that we were talking about earlier. Like for a scientist, the scientific method has those three parts, right? It's like, okay, hypothesis, we start. Then there's experimentation, an analysis, and then there's a conclusion at the end. And if we can repeat the experiment and get the same result or conclusion, then we have it set. We've achieved a truth. I think in the form of a poem, like...
I'm sorry, the truth for now.
Yeah, well, yeah, but a scientist would probably say, and this is because they want tenure, that, it's a truth. I established it. We repeated it. This is our conclusion. But I think a poet isn't so interested, like, I don't even think about the conclusion. I'm interested in the middle part. I don't want to do the third part. I'm interested in the experimentation and the investigation,
right?
And in the continued asking of questions. So it's like this infinitely, perpetually delayed, to use a Marcel Duchamp term, a perpetually delayed conclusion.
Yeah.
This is an inconclusive practice. It's a practice, not a result. The idea is to be in that middle state of experimentation that fuels itself forward, kind of at all times, and not to reach a conclusion, not to build the grand system of the thesaurus or the taxonomic division of species or whatever, to identify every individual within one system, because frankly, life doesn't work like that. There you can point at an exception almost instantaneously and say, well, this doesn't fit in the system. Well, what about this case? Well, what about this? Or it almost seems like the systems produce their exceptions. Yeah. So,
well, I love that, and I have a question and a challenge to the first part, which is that science ever concludes is totally, it's like detrimental to science if it feels that way about its own work, such that people are like, well, that science was proven to be wrong from 20 years ago. Therefore, this science isn't true. And then you get to this death of expertise realm of a realm that actually denies reality. So, or that science even has a purpose, when it's like, no, science is only trying to sharpen a spear tip. And if you read and understand the scientific, not you, but if they were to understand the scientific method, and why don't they? Well, because scientists are posturing that they've found the truth to get their tenure. So that was just what I was feeling there.
Yeah, I was ragging on scientists' need to draw conclusions. I think I was ragging because sometimes scientists are motivated to draw hasty conclusions, to get the FDA to approve a drug that they can advertise on TV, for instance. Underneath, there is no difference between the sort of poetic use of the scientific method and the scientist's method, because you look at the history of the sciences, and scientists deeply understand how it's like, I'm going to take this a little bit forward through this method, and then somebody else is going to start at my conclusion point and take this a little bit forward again. Scientists work great in a community of scientists. Whenever somebody publishes a result, everybody else working in that field or adjacent fields takes that result and they're like, what can I do with this? You know, where can I take this? And so it all just continues to move forward, and you end up establishing a sort of collective truth. It's not like somebody wants to own the truth.
Yeah.
But it feels, the business side of it is a little different. Business side of it for poets is a little different too.
Yeah. So quick question about that. I wanted to come back to, so if, I guess I had said earlier that maybe, or not maybe, but I thought science was really focused on things that could be measured, or else they'd be poets type of thing, right? Like, in essence, the things to be discussed by a poet or a filmmaker or an abstract expressionist are realms that science can't really test. One of my favorite lyricists and musician up there, and largely for the reason not because his lyrics are, well, I just love that Andrew Bird talks about objectivity and subjectivity, mysticism and empirical realms in the same songs, seemingly implying that neither has the answer, but together, poetry and genetics maybe have something better. So I guess what I'm saying is just wondering your thoughts on if that's true. That
I think I think of an example. This is reminding me of an example. There's a book, and I'm not remembering the name of the psychoanalyst who wrote it. It's entitled "The Third Reich of Dreams," and so this was an analyst who was practicing in Germany in the 30s, and she was recording dreams. She started to notice a trend in the sort of anxiety trend in the dreams of her patients. And so then she thought something's happening. Like, different people that I'm talking with are registering the same kind of anxiety. They're registering it in different narrative ways within their dreams, but I'm starting to notice something that seems interconnected, something that seems like a social thing. So she started going around and collecting other people's dreams, not her patients, but, it's like, oh, my aunt had an interesting dream the other night. Okay, I'm going to go over and interview your aunt. So she starts collecting a bunch of different dreams from a bunch of different people in Germany. And what she ends up doing is documenting this deep awareness of the gradual rise of the Nazi state, of totalitarianism, before the party had been established. Just this, like, by very subtle degrees, this gradual, constant rising of totalitarianism within the social sphere, within the public sphere, and how people were registering that privately. And she categorizes it into the sort of narrative elements of the dreams into sort of 7 stories, 7 different ways people are internalizing it. And it's fascinating to me because it's both poetic in a way and very scientific in a way. Like, she's following up on a kind of curiosity. She's not trying to create a study. She's saying, I started noticing these trends. I started looking into these trends, and I started trying to think a little categorically about these trends. And the point of it was, like, what is happening here? What is the meaning of all this? What is this evidence of? It was just all these different kinds of curiosities. It's a fantastic book.
And I mean, it's only in a tragic retrospection does she even know what it was signifying.
Yeah. And
so it's just curiosity.
Like, she had to flee Germany, and she was so afraid of the text. Like, it wasn't published in her lifetime. It was published in the 80s. Sure. That she had passed away. But she hid the book, in her apartment in Berlin. She hid the manuscript and then eventually came back and retrieved it years later. So, it was like, so it's a fascinating book in its own right. As in how it got eventually to us. But it's a really wonderful example, and connects, in an important way with your poem, with sort of looking at dreams as like, what can we learn from what can we learn from this? Like, it's not obviously random information, especially since I'm seeing people registering anxiety around authority figures and authoritative structures, and just authority abstractly.
Right.
And, you know, their own identities have a relationship to it, even in these dreams. You know, there are some people who are like rebels who are saving others from the regime. There are others who end up being prisoners. They are, you know, everything's taken away from them and they're dehumanized within the machine. And there's sort of different roles that emerged from the narratives of the dreams. Yeah, such an interesting book.
Yeah,
and a good sort of middle line that draws, I think, upon these things that some consider opposites. We obviously don't. That shows that these routes of investigation are really kind of the same thing.
Yeah. My only question for you, for her, would be, why not examine these patients' waking life, anxieties of waking life, to sense the same thing? Like, is it relegated to a dream, or can't you sense this while they're recounting their day at work?
In the book, she gives you a description of who these people are, in their waking life, and then the story of the dream they had. You know, so I think to her, these have everything to do with each other. You know, some of these people were, you know, professional business people, or owned a butcher shop, or were grandmothers, or, you know, so there are lots of different kinds of people in society, and she gives you that information. It's not stripped from the narrative of the dream, so it's just a dream study. It's obviously more of a humanist or sociological.
That's the context, but I'm saying, why not just measure the anxiety levels during the day?
Because we, and anxiety, certainly we do this. We hide truths from ourselves. You know, a lot of the time when we say we're worried about this, we're actually using that to hide the fact that we're worried about something else, you know. So the classic case of getting upset about somebody being late when you're actually upset about the fact that your kid is struggling. You know? Yeah.
Well, I guess the reason I'm asking that is that seems obvious enough, right? But why? Like, why can anxiety be can be pulled from a description of a dream? Is it because the person doesn't ascribe any meaning to that, and they're just describing a story, which then the researcher teases out anxiety points and all of that, which is they would self-filter if they were talking about their day because they're self-conscious of their consciousness. Which I guess I'm just trying to understand the value. Like, if we're coming back to an assertion that dreams are not meaningful, what exactly, I mean, it's great the way science and poetry are coming together in her work, but what about my assertion is refuted by, or like what part of that like study is really saying, of course there was really important information there, but like my interest is more, why couldn't you gather that a different way? And if you couldn't, that says something specifically about what's happening in a dream that maybe doesn't happen at any other time.
Well, I think in the specific case of this book, this was her field. You know, she was a psychoanalyst,
right,
and a psychiatrist. So this was the work that she was doing. And I think that another explanation is that, like, so she wasn't a sociologist, you know, going out and, for instance, doing oral histories or a long form interview with people in the waking world. But I think that what she was particularly interested in was how this very subtle, by very minute degrees, but gradual and constant rise of totalitarianism within the country was registering. You know, it's like changes from day to day are not dramatic changes. They're very slight changes.
Yeah.
So you don't think, oh, I saw a policeman ask for someone's identification on the street. You know, you maybe notice it, but don't really think about it. Then when you see it 4 days later in another part of the city, maybe you notice it and you think, oh, I saw that 4 days ago. Huh. I got to go to the store down here. You know, it's like, these aren't dramatic shifts. It's not like, it's not like you go from happy daily life to a prison state from Monday to Tuesday.
Yeah.
You know, so things change in subtle ways on the scale of a society. And how does that register? You know, I think that when some of us who have certain tolerances where we say, hey, look, I saw just in the last week 2 different people get stopped on the street for no reason and asked to show their identification. Something is happening here. I think that most of us would probably say, you're a nut job and you're paranoid. Why don't you just have a drink and let's be happy, you know? Some of us register those things, I think, in waking life. But societal changes happen kind of slowly and subtly, but gradually. And your awareness of them doesn't keep up with that rate of change. Your awareness is often focused on the things right in front of you and your daily life and your own needs and the needs that are in the little circle around you that you travel in, you know? So I think that's an explanation of what she was trying to measure. You know, something on the conscious state is changing too slowly for us to really be aware of it. On the unconscious state, people seem to be registering something that's happening here. And I'm seeing it in the narratives of these dreams. So let's see if I can do some work to develop a description of what's happening that they're registering on an unconscious level that they aren't registering on that conscious level.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas another investigator in another line of work, a sociologist, probably could have done a parallel research project,
Right.
and interviewed people and found that through their narratives of waking life. You know, have you noticed anything odd, like on your street or in your neighborhood? Any changes in the stores?
Right.
Have you noticed uniformed people? What have they been doing? And they would probably have said, you know, I have noticed, like, you know, it used to be just 1 policeman. Now it's 4 policemen. You know, they used to be carrying a billy club. Now they're carrying a submachine gun. I have noticed some stuff. You know, I'm sure that would have been teased out.
Yeah. I'm wondering the sort of like, I'm curious, like, because obviously she, as you said, which is really amazing about this, and then we can move on. But is that she, of course, wasn't like, I mean, I feel like there is this Nazism happen. Like, I mean, the way I understand it was that there was a sort of like vibration for like essentially like saying that in the future, people are worried. Well, people are worried about the future, right? Mm-hmm. And that's anxiety, of course. And then looking backwards on it, she can say, well, they had good reason to be worried. And this was like a canary of sorts. And so I guess I'm just wondering if her work has been applied to other, I mean, like, are people studying anxiety and dreams to understand like political authoritarian like kind of futures?
Well, I think I mean, people must be doing it, right? I mean, that makes sense to me. I think about well, we're seeing globally a rise of far right politics and sort of fascist policies in countries. You know, we're seeing like parliamentary makeups shift, and these far right candidates sort of get a little voting block, and in some cases, almost getting enough of a voting block to be, you know, they're starting to become real participants in forming and organizing governmental bodies, and it's startling. We're seeing it here in the U.S. We're seeing it all throughout Europe. We're seeing it in Asia, and we're seeing, you know, other leaders like Putin and you know, the Brazilian leader, the Turkish leader, you know, actually being legitimately far-right politicians.
Yeah.
So we're seeing all this stuff. And I mean, I'm not sure how it's registering in people's dreams, but I am seeing how it's registering like in movies, for instance. You know, you're seeing movies that are drawing upon this anxiety and exploring it and describing it. You're seeing these narratives that kind of have that idea of, with all these things going on now, we could be headed here, you know?
Yeah.
And so someone with anxiety about that would be drawn to see that movie, be drawn to make that movie. So I certainly see it in our artifacts, you know, these types of same concerns that this analyst was tracking through her dream collection in just cultural production now. Yeah. I mean, I think that's basically the exact same thing.
Yeah.
You know?
The one question, and then we can just figure out if we're going to look at the poem one more time. Or
I think we should.
Yeah. It's, do you want to read it?
Read it aloud?
Or whatever you want to do.
Yeah, let me read it aloud. Okay. Dreams, not meaningful. She, usually she, or come to think also he, they think that there must be, reasonably to them, a significance to dreams. I love that, but I tend not to see the practicality in always seeing symbolically things that seem to be, to me, a day's mere strange data reprocessing. I like strange data hyphenated as one word. I hadn't caught that before. I guess their care for the spiritus air renders daring to simplify, to exercise myopically, and thus a third of life as my time wasted just sleeping. Yeah, a third of life. A third of life asleep. That's remarkable.
That alone is like all the reason to believe in dreams. Or that there's something there, because it, more than just entertainment, at least entertainment, but maybe something more, because, man, I'm working for a third and I'm sleeping for a third.
And mostly eating and going to the bathroom for the rest of the third.
Yeah.
Perfectly honest about things.
Or we're
Drinking. Beverages are a big part of life. It's interesting that sleep is still pretty mysterious. Like, we know a lot of things about what happens during sleep physically.
Right.
We know some things about what happens neurologically, but like the purpose of sleep is still somewhat mysterious. Obviously, we need to rest and recover from experiencing the world for a little while. We need to take a break to return to it, or we start to lose our minds and get super tired. But it is still, I mean, it feels like it's easy to think of it as another land, like to use the metaphor of like a place that doesn't have a map yet, that we haven't explored. You know, if you think of it as this other realm, right? Yeah.
This podcast, I took some notes from this podcast, try to put it up on screen later because it was really interesting. But basically they were talking about, well, why do we sleep? We all know we crave it, you know, when we need it.
Sure.
It's annoying if we're tired when we don't want to be tired, you know, but why are we tired? And this was just one of the first sort of interesting looks. So a dolphin is a mammal. The dolphin needs oxygen to live. A dolphin lives in water. A dolphin sleeps for 8 hours a night. Then how does a dolphin sleep and not drown? Adaptive unispheric magic. Of course, half of their brain rests at a time, taking turns with the other half. So effectively, they are floating near the surface, and half their brain is resting while the other half is saying, let's breathe. For 8 hours a day.
So the other half maintains access to air.
And all the other function,
That's
unispheric.
okay. Yeah. Well, I wonder about this. Like, do we do a comparable thing that keeps us from like wetting the bed every night? You know, I wake up and I'm like, oh damn, I gotta pee. Well, something has been keeping me from peeing for the last several hours of dreaming.
right.
You know, sorry to bring up urinating in your work here. It happens.
Oh no.
But you know, so let's return to the dolphins. That's fascinating. Like there's a level of consciousness, like minimal consciousness, in order to maintain the overall organism that's going on. Yeah.
It's like
that makes
it's
sense
like
to me.
truck drivers, a pair of truck drivers. I'll just say captains of an airplane, flight Asia, right? Just taking turns. Never two folks sitting there together, but you know, yeah. So I wrote that in response to what I was listening to, which is essentially just like now I have to consider all other mammals in the water. And I have to consider, like how this would even potentially come about. And I wrote unispheric next to magic. That's obviously a word the professor was not using, but I love the idea of a very technical unispheric next to magic. And that's just the way, we can describe all the evolutionary pressure that might have caused this or that, or the way that this came about. But at the end of the day, let's call a spade a spade. In 2024, it's fucking magic.
This is reminding me of a little conversation before you got here. Shay and I were talking, and we were talking about like our reading practices as a kid. And I said that when it was bedtime, you know, I wanted to keep reading, but if I read in bed, then I would fall asleep because I was in bed. So what I did was I would stand in the middle of my room, stand up, and read while standing. Because you don't fall asleep, you don't nod off when you're standing, you know. So and Shay was like, that's a perfect kid solution to a problem. You know, you just instantly solve it and then you're good.
Yeah.
It makes perfect sense. Let's move on. And I wonder about
what turned into a future adult.
Like, was this a dolphin decision like that? It's like, well, we'll just have to like use part of the brain to keep breathing. Done.
I mean, Dan Marino was a dolphin.
I love it. Oh my God, you're right.
Ooh, I had Sentiment instead of Sidney Crawford. With that, man, thank you.
Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for recording. Yeah. Thank you for the poem.
Hell yeah.